let everybody get situated for a second more. Thank you very much for the Chertoff group for inviting me here today, and thank you all for coming. There's a fundamental gap in organizations between those responsible for managing and securing information systems and those responsible for setting organizational priorities and understanding organizational obligations for privacy. Now, that's a very long way of saying that engineers and lawyers don't play nicely together. And while that was alluded to in the previous panel, maybe we should just let them, go play with their own toys and not bother each other. Privacy is an inherently interdisciplinary challenge. And so focusing on the individual disciplines doesn't give you the full picture that is necessary to address privacy challenges either as an internal organization or to express to external stakeholders what you're doing about privacy. But this is a very real problem, and let me give you a quick anecdote about sort of how deep this challenge goes. In the privacy world, there's a term, transparency, that is thrown around a lot, and that means an openness of process, telling users why you're collecting their information, how long you're keeping it for, who you're sharing it with, what you're doing with it all the time. And that principle is seen as absolutely critical to organizations looking to maintain a positive privacy posture. But if you've got an engineering background, you probably had a course on system design somewhere in your undergraduate degree where they talked about transparent design. And transparent system design means that individuals, as they use information systems, shouldn't be able to see what's going on behind the scenes. The system should be invisible to them, and they should have a nice, clean user journey through the system without ever seeing the walls and the boundaries and the machinations of the information system you've built. The system should be invisible. It should be transparent. Now, that's pretty much the opposite of what all the privacy people were trying to get at. And so in organizations, this communication gap creates a huge problem for organizations trying to identify privacy problems before they happen, trying to design mitigating strategies and evaluate those mitigating strategies, and as organizations try to communicate about their approaches to privacy to a world of external stakeholders increasingly focused on the need for good privacy protections. But this isn't a problem that is unique to privacy. Cybersecurity had this issue 10 years ago. 10 years ago, when organizations were first finally starting to accept very broadly that this cybersecurity thing is something we need to spend money on, there was a lot of concern about how much money do we need to spend? Who do we need to hire? Is making our systems more secure going to make our systems less easy to use? How does this stack up against other organizational priorities? At that time, cybersecurity as an industry and as a group of professionals was very concerned about how do we demonstrate the value of increased security for systems, and how do we show that we're just as valuable as ease of use, as other financial priorities for the organization, and get the resources we need dedicated to make information systems effectively effectively secure. At this point, risk management became a critical tool for providing a set of processes and a common tongue for cybersecurity professionals to communicate across organizations and outside of organizations about what the risks were and how to mitigate them. Because the truth is that organizational leadership, they never really cared about what vulnerability in the web server makes it vulnerable to a distributed denial of service attack. All they cared about is what's the likelihood of an attack and how long is the website going to be down. So there's been an increasing amount of research in the last few years, including by those of us at NIST, at other organizations like MITRE and the Center for Information Policy Leadership and a number of other organizations, about what risk management might add to organizations' existing privacy practices. Organizations now focus their privacy practices primarily on trying to adhere to sets of generally recognized principles. Things like the Fair Information Practice principles, the Privacy by Design principles, and these principles are very high-level aspirational goals. Things like transparency, things like accountability, data minimization. And while these goals have been incredibly critical to organizations attempting to define what they mean for their intentions about privacy and information systems, they don't tend to tell organizations what about the systems they've designed will keep them from accomplishing those goals. And as we talked about earlier, those goals can have many different interpretations within organizations. So it facilitates this continued siloed approach to privacy by security practitioners and by privacy practitioners. And if you're doing that in two separate venues, you're not catching the full context of what privacy risk might mean to your organization. If you're focused exclusively on data protection, you're not going to necessarily see that the approved release of certain information or the analysis of certain information might lead to the stigmatization of an individual within their community because of their particular political or social context. If you're overly focused on insulating the organization from liability concerns, you're not going to catch that particular technical analyses of data that you might use to determine if people are eligible for your services might inappropriately exclude someone from your services. So let me give you, that was a lot of sort of high-level language, but let me give you an idea of how this actually manifests in practice. Because we at NIST have developed a draft set of privacy risk management assessment tools that we've had the opportunity to pilot with a couple of partners within the federal government and with a couple of private sector entities that have volunteered to help us figure this out. One of those private sector companies was an online identity startup. And one of the key differentiators they saw for their product was that they felt that this online identity product was privacy enhancing. So any risks to individuals as related to privacy that might arise while using their service were absolutely critical for them to understand. So their privacy officer ran through a privacy risk assessment with us, identified a number of issues that might affect individuals, because that's where privacy risk happens. It happens to real people. It doesn't happen to organizations. Bad things might happen to organizations as the result of doing bad things to people. But if you want to be focused on privacy risk, you need to see what might happen to actual people. So she identified a number of risks based on their context that might arise through the use of the system. And we were going through some of those risks and talking about, well, what uses of data might facilitate these risks. And I was in a meeting with the chief operating officer, the privacy officer, and one of their DevOps engineers. And the chief operating officer and the privacy officer were saying, well, okay, well, here's the data that we're concerned about using here, and we use it for this purpose, and we think those purposes are pretty critical to the facilitation of our system. But after that, we don't need it anymore, so we just dump it. You know, that's a privacy-enhancing component of our system. And the engineer said, well, actually, if you're concerned about this particular thing happening to people, the information that's relevant to that risk, we keep that for 2 years. And 2 years is a much different risk profile than keeping it for no years. It puts them in a much different competitive environment when talking about the privacy-enhancing capabilities of their system. So I think that over the next few years, you're going to hear a lot more about privacy risk management, because as organizations look to materialize those high-level sets of principles that they adhere to and that they set for themselves as goals, they're going to need better tools to communicate internally between the disciplines operating within their organization and to their external stakeholders. And while things like transparency and accountability and all of those goals aren't going anywhere, making them manifest within the design of information systems requires a broader set of tools that accesses the skill sets of the different professionals contributing to the space. Thank you.